Visual. Hi, so today we're happy to be welcoming Jarrod, who gave an amazing video for us already, but I bet we'll have a couple of questions for him about the tuba and the tuba in orchestra, and also the big question, the tuba and lugging around the tuba. So I don't know, Jarrod, if you want to say anything to start, or we'll just throw a few questions at you.
Um, I I don't really know what else to say. I mean, I tried to put together, obviously, like the video I put together was more geared towards like the composer side of things, but I tried to add in like some general information and just kind of context in different situations. Obviously, from a conductor's perspective, like the only time you're really going to be dealing with the tuba is in the orchestra or like in a band. I mean, there's not much chamber orchestra work that involves the tuba. Um, and a lot of our chamber stuff is usually small chamber ensemble unconducted, but um, hopefully the information was still helpful and somewhat relevant.
Definitely. And Jarrod, as you know,
Yeah.
I'm going to be picking your brain because if we end up, because of COVID, having to go to smaller groups, we're going to have to try to find some ways to keep you playing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so guys, go ahead and ask a question, or if somebody's having trouble with their internet, put it in the chat. Probably some of the same questions we usually ask are relevant to see what his take is on some of this stuff, I think.
Yeah, I have a couple questions I've asked everyone, but also I have one that's like specific actually to tuba. Um, so it was really cool to watch. It's a lot more virtuosic than I had previously known, which you sort of mentioned in the video, like, oh, not everyone knows it can do all this, which was really cool to hear. In terms of articulation, that was quite interesting. I'm just sort of wondering what you feel like are the like in terms of your range, your dynamic range on the tuba, what could reasonably be asked for, and also like within the brass section, finding balance. How do you guys like how do tubas talk to trombone players versus trumpet players, and how do you sort of find your balance and tune within the section?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's an interesting dynamic because they always say like the principal player leads. So you're always looking towards like the principal trumpet and then past that the principal trombone. But balance wise, they always talk about balancing to the bottom. So um, I mean, I obviously am aware of what the section and the ensemble is doing and try to keep in the constraints of that. But a lot of the time, it gets asked for the trombone section to fit into my sound. Generally, and it depends on the piece and the writing styles, but generally, the tuba is the sound and the bass trombone is the articulation. Like it's sort of a homogeneous sound. Like the tuba adds the depth, and the bass trombone usually defines like the articulation. Um, so it's just kind of like like I said, it depends with the piece and just kind of like being aware of what's happening in the context of everything. I think dynamic range wise, I mean, anything is game. Like the tuba can play really loud if you need it to. I mean, there are some pretty egregious recordings out there of tuba players that have just been asked to go wild. And then also like very soft in situations like Mahler 1. Like the Mahler 1 solo is a really good example of that. There's another it's another part of Mahler 1. There's like this long sustain, it's like 18 bars of a pianissimo low F that you're just sustaining. Like it's kind of a pain. But yeah, I mean, the dynamic range really is so wide just because, I mean, the way it's designed, like it can play so loud or soft if you need it to.
Awesome, good to know. Very good to know. Yeah, because we were talking to Ian last week, and obviously trombone doesn't have the same flexibility when it comes to playing softly. So,
Yeah.
and then flute doesn't have the same flexibility when it comes to playing loud. So these are good to know. Thanks.
Yeah, and kind of adding on to that, like I say that it can play very softly, but that is relative to other instruments. Like obviously, a flute player or a clarinet player,
Right.
like it's going to be able to play a lot softer. But
Great.
I love the description of, which I guess is just obvious to you, but I never really comprehended so clearly. Now, between hearing from you and Ian, that the tuba is maybe filling out the sound and the bass trombone being the articulation. But is that something that you guys are going to work on yourselves in your little, sectionals on the break kind of thing? Or is that something that a conductor could alter the balance of a little bit? Like, is it fair game for us to say, well, my pet peeve would be particularly that the bass trombone is going a little too crazy. But I mean, is it fair for us to work on an internal balance that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's completely fair because, I mean, obviously we can only hear where we are. So we don't know how it sounds like from the podium, and we don't know how it sounds in the audience. And like I said, like situationally, it can be completely different. I mean, there are plenty of situations where bass trombone and tuba are in different parts. So then obviously they have different responsibilities. And there's sometimes that you would rarely have you would rarely reverse the roles, but they could come a little closer to each other in certain situations. So that's definitely something that I think can be asked for from the podium. I mean, because we only have so much reference in the back row.
And how much do you rely on watching the principal trumpet or maybe the principal trombone for time, or do you ever even watch the bow of the concertmaster?
Principal trombone is definitely something that I key into a lot, just because, when we have low brass introitus, like he's usually who I look to. I rarely look to the principal trumpet. I mean, first of all, it's kind of difficult because he's so far away. There's some situations that you have to, but most of the time, I mean, I don't ever really look at the concertmaster because I don't trust myself to know where the timing of their bow is. That's just not in my wheelhouse. But a lot of the time, timing wise, I mean, I'm keying into like what the principal players are. I'm listening to the percussion section because, I mean, I have them right there as reference, and trying to balance that out with like what the conductor's doing and how much delay that I think there might be from my sound reaching the hall. So it just kind of, depends on the situation, but.
Thank you. Somebody else?
Yes. I was gonna ask. Jeez, sorry, my mind is flustered. But could you is there like do you have a preference between, I guess, like orchestra rep and say like wind band repertoire? Like do you have a preference?
Not really. I mean, they both have their strong suits, and I really like them both. I don't get to play wind band nearly as much as I wish I did, because I think just because of the make of the ensemble in wind bands, you get so much more in the part. Like the parts are, you have to play all the stuff that the string players like the cello and basses would play in the orchestra. But at the same time, there's like the sound of an orchestra is very different from the sound of a wind band. So they really each have their own pros and cons, but I really enjoy playing in them both. And I wish I got to do more wind band stuff, actually.
When you went to undergrad, did you go to a school like Michigan or something that had a bunch of that, or not really?
Well, I went to East Carolina University, but the majority of what I did was wind band. I mean, I didn't play in the school orchestra until like second semester of my senior year. So
I see.
the majority of what people do there is wind band. I mean, obviously growing up in high school, like that's what we play. And I think there's a lot of really great wind band repertoire out there that people don't realize. I mean, a lot of incredible stuff by Morton Gold and John Corgliano and Michael Schwartner. And I mean, there's so much great music out there that's kind of stigmatized because it's band music as opposed to orchestra music.
Okay, Jarrod, so can you find us some pieces that are like under 20 people so that we might have to do some of this depending on whether we go, full, medium?
Yeah, I'm glad to look for it. I mean,
Okay, that's your assignment. Get back in touch with me. To anybody who's listening to this, we're going to keep tone going no matter what, whether we've got 75 people or in groups of smaller ones for the time being. Anybody else?
Yeah, I've asked most of the players this just to be aware. Are there any perhaps pet peeves that you have around things that conductors say to tuba players sort of out of ignorance, or anything we should really be aware of
Um,
in that regard?
yeah, that's an interesting one.
Just like, yeah, most other people are like, 'cause sometimes people don't understand that they ask for X and we can't do X or whatever.
Yeah, again, there's nothing specific that comes to mind. It's kind of just situational things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, not a whole lot. The only thing I'd say sometimes is dynamics. Like there is a tendency sort of conductors to hear um, like when brass sections play harshly, it can come off as being too loud. And a lot of times, like a conductor will hear that sound and automatically just throw the hand up. And it's not necessarily the volume level; it's the harshness of the section, or that the intonation isn't great. Um,
Huh.
I think volume can really, I mean, obviously, can really fill out an orchestra sound if it's good sound. And I think too many times composers or conductors are too quick to say that's too loud instead of like trying to let the section adjust this tone quality. Um, yeah.
And do you think that so that's really good to know. Um, do you think that because I know that different orchestras sort of play with it, like brass sections play with sort of a different attack style, like Chicago Symphony versus Vienna, obviously really, really different sound. And I was reading about it, and they were talking about sort of the like attack decay of the Chicago sound versus
Mm-hmm.
sort of a gentler attack. And so, do you think that that potentially sort of messing with the style of the onset could be what is the problem, or the problem, or could change the sound if it's not a volume thing?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and Chicago is a really good example of that because Chicago, like, their reputation has been their brass section for so many years.
Oh, yeah.
And like that's kind of where they've gotten their notoriety. And the interesting thing is a lot of people that I've heard that have gone and seen that Chicago section say like, yes, they play loud, but most of the time they're just playing really full and really richly. Like when the section is super locked in and just has like really equal tone qualities and they're like all the horns are making the same sound, that homogeneity um, adds like warmth and volume, not as in like decibel meter, but just like a fullness to the sound.
Yeah, I got it.
And Chicago really, that attack decay idea, like, because if you like present them with your articulation style and you start strong, like you don't need to sustain all of that note. Like the audience can get the idea and it can reverberate and the sound can naturally like kind of exist that way.
Cool. Okay. Interesting to think about. Thank you. Big fan of Chicago brass.
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
How are you guys like affected like by logistics, say like temperature or probably just like the venue? Because I know like for instance like Olin like kind of sucks to me, but like as opposed to maybe the Fisher Center. So like how are you guys affected by stuff like that?
Yeah. I mean, hall acoustics have a lot to do with brass players because of how directional our sound is. Um, like I know as a tuba player, every hall is different because like sometimes I'm right up against the shell of the hall and my sound just instantly bounces out and is super loud. And sometimes I'm like far away or angled more into the hall and I like my sound just kind of swamps. So and the same thing like with the brass section, I think like the depth of a hall and the height of a hall can really affect how the sound bounces off and comes out to the audience as well. Temperature-wise, it doesn't really. I mean, if it's cold, like the horn gets cold, but it warms up through playing. Um, it can affect, in the extremes, it can affect intonation, but I rarely experience orchestra halls that have those kind of issues.
I have actually three questions. The first one is comparing to bass trombone. If you play sforzando, so attack will be more lazy, but how would you compare it to bass trombone? Is it really different?
I don't think it's too different. I mean, obviously the bass trombone is going to naturally respond easier because the instrument is shorter, but the idea and intent of the execution is pretty much the same.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, I know that there are a lot of different types of tuba, three valves, 4 and 5. How are they different?
Um, it just kind of comes down to preference a lot of the time. Like usually younger students play on 3 valves because it's easier. You start adding more valves as you get into higher quality instruments for intonation purposes and being able to hit all the notes. You have to have 5 valves to be able to hit every note in the series. So most professional tubas have 5. And then you rarely see this on larger tubas. This is more on like F or E flat bass tubas that you use for solo work. Sometimes they have anywhere up to 8 valves just for specific intonation purposes. But it kind of just 5 is pretty standard, 5 or 4 on most intermediate professional level instruments.
Good to know. And the last question is, you in your video you showed pretty cool technique of glissando, but how do I know which glissandos are possible and which are not?
It's a good question. I think if you're talking specifically about like the half valve technique that I used, I think any glissando is possible. That allows you to play in any range of the horn. So I don't think there's really any restrictions that I can think of in that regard.
I mean, if I write for a trombone, so I know that I can write within a tritone below below harmonic. Is it somewhat similar?
No, it's different because the way the tuba, like with valved instruments, when you're half valving, it essentially makes it so that you can play in any register of the horn when you're in the half valve position. It's not restricted because the trombone, like when they're doing glisses, they're still playing the actual full notes of their horn. They can't, unless they have a trigger, they can't do like a half valve technique. So I think it's a little different than trombone glissando.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hi, I saw from a lot of Verdi operas, they have they call for an instrument called a Chim Basso.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, is this instrument, if we don't have this instrument, is it this part often given to a tuba player?
Yes. So the Chim Basso parts, Chim Basso or Chim Bassi are usually pitched in the key of F, which is the same as like my F bass tuba. It's very similar to Berlioz is written for ophicleide, but if you don't have an ophicleide, you just play it on a bass tuba. So most people, if they don't have access to a Chim Basso, will play Chim Basso parts on F tuba.
Ah, I see. It's not transposed, it's just pitched in F.
Yeah, because
Right,
all tuba
right.
is concert pitch.
concert pitch. Yes, yes. Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So Jarrod, the Chim Basso and the Ophicleide would be a lighter sound?
The Ophicleide definitely is. The original Ophicleide is a very different instrument from the tuba because it's a keyed instrument, basically like a saxophone.
Right.
With but the Chim Basso, it's not necessarily a lighter sound. It's actually a more punctual trombone-like instrument. It's basically a long valved trombone. So it fits into the trombone section a lot more. And you see it a lot in Verdi and Puccini and a lot of the Italian operas.
I see. I know that there's an Ophicleide hanging around that isn't necessarily so popular to play, a specific one, but we don't have a Chim Basso, right?
No.
Okay. Should that go on a wish list or not necessarily?
I would love for it to be, but it is a very specialty instrument. I mean, really, unless you're playing Verdi or Puccini, you're not going to use Chim Basso.
I see. Okay. Okay. Well, maybe we'll wait on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, go ahead.
I was hoping I'd get to play it on the Verdi Requiem last year because that would have been cool. But
Right.
I was gonna say, what's Leon's next opera?
Yeah.
Desire after Salome could be Trovatore or something.
Yeah, I don't really know. Everything is, getting
Yeah, of
put on
course.
hold a little bit, but it's possible. I don't think those are his interests so much, the Italian ones. Not.
Yeah, I don't think so either. He's a turn of the century Vienna guy.
Yeah.
Right.
Anybody else? Again, Jarrod.
I'm curious.
Should tell me, of course.
Is a tuba in general the most expensive instrument in the brass family?
In the brass family, yes. The instruments are the most expensive, I would say. I mean, costs are changing a little bit. Newer companies are developing instruments a lot cheaper than they used to be. But to my knowledge, I mean, other instruments have to buy more. Like trumpet player will have to have multiple trumpets, and trombone players will usually either have like a bass and a tenor or a tenor and an alto. Horn players, I think, only have to buy one instrument. But yeah, tubas can get very expensive.
You guys should have some egos, a lot of egos.
Yeah.
Okay.
Last call. All right, Jarrod, thank you so much for taking your time now and for taking all the prep time before you put that video forth. It was great, really, really informative. And I know I'll be referring to it again myself, and I'm sure others will too.
No, I'm just glad I could help. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much.